Last week we looked at English Romantic painting. We concentrated on the importance, the primacy of landscape with the contemporary artists John Constable and JMW Turner. I actually didn't finish Turner. There was one final work that I did want to show you, but it's really a good way to get back into talking about Romanticism in England, because we also need to look at the tradition of what's known as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And then we get to return to France, which is always sort of my favorite place to return to, find out what's going on there. I remind you that we had these two great English landscape painters, one of whom was exceedingly successful, the Romantic abstractionist, the other of whom, really had a struggle throughout his life, the Romantic naturalist, who was Constable. But we were finishing up with Turner, and I wanted to show you a relatively late work. Did you see that? I just changed the date. What we see with JMW Turner is someone who translates nature into a kind of abstraction. And he's particularly enamored of light. He traveled to Venice. He traveled extensively. Remember, I told you Constable did not, unless it was to the Stour Valley. Turner did. And when he visited Venice on at least 2 different occasions, he became very much aware of how light can look differently in different places with different kinds of weather. And he began to transform the effects of light and moisture in the air, increasingly becoming interested in light and color and atmospheric perspective as sort of enigmas. In 1844, Turner painted this work, one of his last great paintings, which was exhibited at the Royal Academy exhibition. It's called Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western Railroad. It's not really that large. It's about 4 feet wide by 2 feet 9 inches in height. But it is a painting whose subject, in fact, is the railway, the railroad. And in fact, the Great Western Railway was the largest railway in England. The subject matter in this work is the train. Now, I know I'm going to talk about all of the other things that are going on, but really the primary subject, the focal point for us would be the train. And what we're looking at, of course, in the context of the 19th century is that changes have been taking place at breakneck speed in Britain during the 19th century, which is the century of the Industrial Revolution. Turner was living in this period of change. And it's literally in the 1830s in Britain that we get this dramatic shift, this sort of paradigm shift, because you tell me, what do you think was the major form of transportation in England in 1830?
Horse and carriage.
Horse and carriage, the horse, exactly. By the 1840s, the English were in the forefront in the development of successful steam locomotives, building hundreds of miles of track, literally changing the view of the countryside and of the cities. Turner's advancing train becomes an analogy for the unavoidable advancement of technology. He is telling you, and there it is, he is telling you, use Twitter. I just made that up. that technology is, I think technology has not advanced as swiftly as since the 19th century as it has in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The transformation is remarkable, what we've gone through in terms of how we communicate. We are seeing in this painting an onrushing railway train. It is moving into our space. Okay, moving forward, we can see the track on a bridge that goes off to the right-hand side of the painting. The train is crossing that new bridge. All kinds of new bridges had to be constructed over rivers. In this case, it's the Thames River. And we're reminded perhaps of the more romantic, intimate bridges of earlier days, because you can see here's another bridge over on the left-hand side of the painting. But Turner, of course, as much as he is, and I'll ask you, is he celebrating technology? Or, what is happening here in terms of the advance of the steam engine and steam locomotive? Is he reminiscing to some extent about the past? And is he sad? Because there's some really interesting details in this painting. Look, right over here. What do you see here? Do you remember what Constable used to paint all the time?
Pastoral scenes?
Yeah, pastoral scenes with a farmer, with a plow, and 2 horses. So it's a very romantic sort of sensibility, looking to the past. This is still going on, but the dominant element here in this roaring kind of perspective that goes into the background space, but of course is coming forward toward us, that's what dominates this work. The plowmen and the pastoral scenes are disappearing. The sky is swirling with gold and white and seems to represent perhaps a summer rainstorm, which has just ended. There's that wonderful sense that there still may be a little bit of rain coming down. You can see by the kind of vertical or angled strokes that come from a sky that is both cloudy and blue. We can see the Thames River here. And I think I brought in another detail to show you because this is a very unusual painting. Turner is also showing us what look like some people in sort of classical garb on the side of the Thames. And they look like they're sort of dancing around. So again, that's a very romantic sort of sensibility to show kind of these classical looking figures on the side of the Thames River. Has Turner created a romantic view of the modern world, combining these sort of bucolic pastoral scenes with the fact that machine technology is going to obliterate all of this? Or is the work a kind of affirmation that we could live together, we could celebrate together? What is inevitable here in terms of what Turner is telling us about the beauty of the English landscape and cityscape and the Industrial Revolution? One reviewer of the 1844 exhibition wrote about this work, "As for Mr. Turner, he has out-prodigied all former prodigies. The world has never seen anything like this picture." We cannot go to England in the 19th century and talk about Romanticism without talking about a group of artists, and we're going to look at them relatively quickly because they're certainly not quite as important historically or art historically to this time period as Constable and Turner. But I'm talking about the pre-Raphaelites. So you hear the word Raphael, We've heard of Raphael before, the Renaissance painter, so admired, for instance, by Ingres. This is the pre-Raphaelites. Pre-capital R-A-P-H-A-E-L-I-T-E. The pre-Raphaelites. The pre-Raphaelites actually organized a brotherhood in 1848, formed out of the belief that the English art establishment and British art in general was artificial, academic, and decadent. They felt a particular contempt for the Royal Academy of London and its teachings. And so I just wanted to remind you of the Royal Academy. I show you the Royal Academy today. This is what's called Burlington House. And what I think is particularly wonderful, and there's a show of Rodin at the time, but there's a statue. You see it there, and I focus in on it. This is a statue of Joshua Reynolds, so the first president of the Royal Academy. He had died in 1792. The statue actually dates to the 1930s, so it wasn't put up in the 19th century. But this would be an individual whom the Pre-Raphaelites would particularly not care for. The artists who are associated with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood are three English painters: Dante Gabriel Rossetti, R-O-S-S-E-T-T-I, John Everett Millais, M as in Mary, I-L-L-A-I-S, again, M-I-L-L-A-I-S, and William Holman Hunt, H-U-N-T, William Holman Hunt. Now, there were other lesser-known painters who associated themselves with this brotherhood, but those are the most important artists, and we're going to look at works by each of them. These young artists believed that the downfall of painting had come with the late Renaissance, especially with the late Renaissance and the period known as Mannerism in the late Renaissance. And as an example, they couldn't stand this work, a late work by Raphael Sanzio, who in fact dies suddenly in 1520. So this really is a late work. And it's a kind of transforming work in terms of sort of post-Renaissance, late Renaissance. Because unlike a Renaissance painting that tends to be very controlled, if you think of the School of Athens, for instance, even though there are many figures, everything is very carefully controlled and balanced in relationship to one part to another. And we know where we are in space. It's Renaissance perspective. Color is controlled. They looked at this Raphael and they said, what the hell is going on? I mean, we know this is supposed to represent the biblical account of the Transfiguration, but there's so much going on here. It's so bizarre in terms of some of the postures, and there's a kind of material realm down below, a heavenly realm up above. In its grandiosity, it's lost any element of truth as far as the Pre-Raphaelites were concerned. So they call themselves Pre-Raphaelites. They preferred anything that came a bit earlier in a style which they felt had clarity. They also dedicated themselves to reviving religious painting. They're similar to the German Nazarenes in the 19th century, with whose work, by the way, they were familiar. It's a similar kind of desire to go back, to revive something that you feel was more idealistic, was more perfect in the past. They promoted, in fact, a kind of archaizing tradition, a kind of, I don't want to call it old-fashioned, but painting that was simple and honest, not complex. very carefully rendered, careful detail, kind of naturalistic observation of nature. One has to wonder in part, you remember that photography has been invented by this time. Photography is invented by 1837, 1839, and we're going to be talking about photography because the implications for painting are enormous. So you have to start to wonder if there's not the essence of a desire to reach to some extent, the kind of truth of the world revealed in photography. In any case, at the Royal Academy exhibition in 1850, John Everett Millais showed Christ in the house of his parents. Again, the Pre-Raphaelites were very concerned that the most appropriate subject matter for art should be Christian subject matter, and that's where one should begin, or at least that the subject would, in fact, in a kind of ethical and moral way, lead one to living an appropriate life. So what do we have here? Well, we know, according to tradition, that Joseph, the father of Jesus, not the biological father, but the father of Jesus on earth, was a carpenter, yes? So we're seeing Millais try to show us an image in which we see Jesus in his father's workshop, and he has injured himself, he's cut himself, and by George, he's got a cut right in the middle of his palm, which of course makes reference to the stigmata, to the wounds from the cross. So this is a kind of premonition, right? This is in his childhood, but it's kind of prophetic of what is to come. The painting was condemned, not because of the realism of details, but because it was too secular. It wasn't religious enough. Secular means non-religious, dealing too much with all of the different aspects of everyday life, all of the details from the shavings on the floor to the tools that we see here, that it's simply too realistic. In fact, the attacks on the work were similar to the kinds of attacks on the work of Gustave Courbet in France. What was the date of Courbet's Stonebreakers? Do you remember approximately? I know that realism was not on the last test, but about 1848? Yeah, so we're talking about exactly the same period of time. So it was felt that there were awkward poses here, ordinary-looking people. Oh my, the same kinds of criticisms that Courbet was hearing in France. Yes?
When you say the painting is condemned, what do you mean by that?
The critics didn't like it. This does not come up to the traditions of the Royal Academy. It's inferior. So it's not official condemnation, but sort of condemnation in the press and by the critics. Pre-Raphaelitism was in some ways a revolt against the materialism of the Industrial Revolution in England. And it was also very much reflective of the Victorian age. Remember that Victoria had become queen in 1837. And Victoria's reign really brought in to place a very different sort of consciousness about English society and tradition, because her precursors had all been sort of profligate and whatever, that did not, in fact, were not in fact highly respected, and even historically continue not to be highly respected. But she was very different from her predecessors. In many ways, the Victorian age and what was written, what was painted at this time, what works of sculpture we find, was romantic escapism, an obsession with what's precious and charming and adorable. And in large part, the Victorian age, with its emphasis on the sentimental and the pretty and the moralizing aspects of society was actually foremost promoted by Queen Victoria herself. Queen Victoria was married to her first cousin, Albert, whom she absolutely adored. They had 9 children together. 5 of them are shown here in an official portrait. When he died, and he died relatively young, she went into mourning for the rest of her life, and that was a very long period of time. So this was a family unit that served as a model of the way a family should be, and so you can see what I'm talking about. Look at those charming children. Their hair is just perfectly coiffed, and they're wearing beautiful dresses, and they may be playing a little bit, but look how charming and well-behaved they are. And then you can see the kinds of cartoons that would come out, sort of, in a sense, sort of mocking the perfection, the syrupy domesticity of Victoria, the licentiousness of the Georgian age. And remember, these were her uncles, relatively speaking, George III, George IV, and William IV, and finally Victoria, because there was no male heir to the British throne. Dante Gabriel Rossetti was an Italian immigrant who studied painting and did well enough to become a probationary student at the Royal Academy. You see him here in a portrait by William Holman Hunt, which again has that kind of absolute clarity and realism that the Pre-Raphaelites were attempting to emulate by looking at pre-Raphael Italian painting, 15th century Italian painting, and to some extent even Netherlandish painting. What's interesting about this work from 1853 and some of the other sort of hyper-realistic, and some of you actually use that word to describe the African woman on the Unknown. I wouldn't have called it hyper-realism. This is hyper-realism. This is almost photographically realistic. And what's interesting about that is that Jan van Eyck's painting of Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride, the Arnolfini wedding, a very important example of Netherlandish Renaissance painting, came into the collection of the National Gallery of London in 1842. So we know that Ingres looked at Jan van Eyck and found his work to be extraordinary, again, in that kind of hyper-realism. But Dante Gabriel Rossetti did as well. Rossetti was preoccupied with the idea of a perfect kind of spiritual painting, a perfect sort of religious Christian painting. Very much drawn to the art and poetry of William Blake, who had died in 1827, by the way. His name was actually Gabriel Charles Rossetti, but he was an Italian, and he wanted to be called Dante because he admired Dante Alighieri, the 14th century Italian poet, whose Divine Comedy we've talked about a number of times in this class as a source of subject matter inspiration. This is a famous work by Rossetti called Ecce Ancilla Domini, which translates not the Annunciation, but Behold, the handmaiden of God. It was exhibited in 1850, but not in the Royal Academy exhibition, at a more liberal institution, the National Institute. He was going to paint a second painting that was to be the companion piece, sort of like a diptych sort of altarpiece, and that subject was to be the death of the Virgin, but that work was never completed. This work has been described by the modern art historian Robert Rosenberg in this way. The blonde angel Gabriel, his feet floating on heavenly fire, invades the Virgin's white bedchamber. She in turn recoils, registering in both her averted gaze and her cringing physical withdrawal that the innocence and purity of her mind and body are somehow to be violated. And isn't that interesting? That's never how you think about the Annunciation. But remember, this is the Victorian era. Rosenblum continues, without the Christian attributes, the lilies that Gabriel is holding, the halos, the dove, the Virgin might almost be interchangeable with a Victorian maiden troubled by the stirrings of puberty, a theme that in fact was common in many contemporary genre paintings that dealt with the ardors and rituals of proper and improper courtship. So in a sense, this is a painting about sexuality in the context of the Victorian era and sort of suppressed sexuality. Rossetti had always had a strong commitment to art, but it was always said by his critics, and even as art historians look at the work later on, he had the commitment, he just didn't have the talent to go with it. So that a number of things are rather odd, including the floorboards and the floor itself. I would like you to explain to me how we go from what look like some tiles here, creating what look like should be orthogonals, right, that coincide with the edge of the bed, going back to a vanishing point. What actually happens to it here? It becomes the wall. It's like we have no place to go. Our eyes can't quite figure it out. The bodies of both of the figures are relative, although that's a nice right arm, I must say, on the angel Gabriel. He spent a lot of time on that. I would say that the bodies beneath the draperies leave something to be desired, and whereas this arm is a pretty nice arm in terms of the way it's painted anatomically, realistically, I would question this arm. And I also wonder, where is her left arm? Because basically it's melted into the wall. So there were so many issues about this painting in terms of the kind of incompetence of parts of it. But it is true, if you look at Mary, she is a Victorian female. She has ruby red lips, she has white skin, she has red hair. This is the same female figure we see in so many Victorian paintings. So, a kind of Victorian metaphor of sexual innocence and experience in this painting, which, Rossetti never really intended it that way. It was supposed to be a modern Annunciation. I want to finish with a work by William Holman Hunt. Hunt was somewhat like David. Now wait until I finish saying how he was like David, because he really couldn't paint like David. He assumed the role of moralist as a painter. In other words, he felt there needed to be a kind of moral narrative, a story that's told that is going to make whoever views the painting hopefully better, or think about how they could be better. And when painting starts to preach to you, when any work of art starts to preach to you, it really turns you off. It kind of has to find its way in terms of meaning. It can't be overly preachy. In Awakening Conscience, Hunt is representing a common theme of 19th century literature and art, that a man may be in love with a young woman to whom he is espoused, but he has a mistress on the side. A husband may be devoted to his wife, but he has 3 mistresses on the side. He's had affairs. And remember, this is the Victorian era, and Victoria and Albert were not like that. So they're teaching us something else. And there's a kind of prudery in what they're teaching us. And what we're seeing here is a young woman with a consort here, with her boyfriend. She's basically a kept woman, we're to understand. They've been sitting at the piano, singing together. We don't know if the sex comes before or after this point. But all of a sudden, she jumps up from his lap, and she's looking out the window as if she's seen something. It's almost like William Blake seeing something, a spirit or a religious figure in a tree. And this is the moment of transformation, because we understand now that this is the awakening conscience. She understands that she must turn away from a life of licentiousness and sex and become a better person. The melodramatic quality of the work is almost too much for us to bear today, although the work was praised as being very truthful to nature, so being a naturalistic representation. But there are a number of things that are just so interesting here. The engraving or painting above the piano is supposed to represent the woman taken in adultery. So there's a moralizing message that she hasn't seen, I guess, for a while. I'm not sure what song they're singing, but I'm quite sure that whatever it is also a kind of message to her. There's this wonderful cat down below who's actually caught a mouse and is kind of playing with it. And so this is good and evil, isn't it? I mean, that's very traditional in painting. And so it is a work, again, that is just a bit too much in terms of how it preaches to us, but it is an example of another example of Romanticism in England in the mid-19th century. Any questions?